The families of 3 people killed in a pontoon boat capsizing on Flagstaff Lake last summer are suing the boat's manufacturer. The Sea-Doo Switch pontoon capsized last August, trapping 2 women underneath the overturned boat. A 3rd woman died after being flown to a hospital. 2 other passengers injured. The lawsuit was filed on behalf of the families of the 3 people who died, as well as the 2 survivors who were injured and witnessed the deaths. The lawsuit alleges the boat was defective and also claims a previous safety recall failed to correct the problem that led to the capsizing. The manufacturer has not yet responded to the lawsuit.